Dear friends, it is an honor for me to introduce John Russo, tonight's speaker, a Baha'i since 1973, who is a retired lawyer and federal acquisition and contracting consultant. John was born and raised in South Philadelphia as a Catholic, the eldest of 6 siblings. He served as an altar boy and choir boy for a number of years in elementary school. He was planning to go to a seminary to become a Catholic priest after high school, but his parents felt that he should complete college before pursuing the priesthood. After completing his college education, he served in the US Navy as a linguist cryptanalyst in Korean and Spanish, and for Navy intelligence, stationed in South Dade, Miami, Florida, and subsequently as an intelligence analyst for the Center for Naval Analysis in Roslyn in Arlington, Virginia. After he graduated from George Mason University School of Law in Arlington, he practiced law for a number of years in Reston and Tyson's Corner. Additionally, he has over 40 years of experience in the federal acquisition and contracting fields, both in the government and as a consultant in industry. Having been a Baha'i for 38 years, he has served on local spiritual assemblies of various communities, and for several years, he served as the principal of One World Baha'i School at the Northern Virginia Baha'i Center. Currently, he resides in the town of Vienna, Virginia, with his wife, Yasmin, and his 2 children, Sean and Lydia. Friends, I give John Russo to you, and today he's going to talk about Louis Gregory. Thank you.
If it's okay, I'll switch over to our opening prayer now. Thank you, Marissa.
Oh God, my God, my beloved, my heart's desire. Oh Dios, mi Dios, mi bien amado, el deseo de mi corazón. The blood, the exalted one, is the morn of truth. The blood, the exalted one, is the morn of truth.
This is part of the Baha'i Heroes and Heroines series presented by John Russo and hosted by the Northern Virginia Baha'i Center Task Force. And I'll hand it over to John. Thank you, John.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you to the task force of the Baha'i Center for giving me the opportunity to talk about Louis Gregory. This is the fourth in the series on the subject of heroes and heroines of the Baha'i Faith, mostly Western heroes and heroines of the Baha'i Faith. We started with Louis Getzinger several years ago, and then moved on to Thomas Breakwell and then Julia Thompson. And we had a little bit of a break during which we were honored to have Hillary Chapman talk about the life of Leroy Iowis as a member of his family. And then I come back with Louis George Gregory as a presentation. This will continue, hopefully, well into the future. So welcome. This was a special honor, doing the research and preparing this presentation for the center. The timing couldn't be more perfect, in my view. We just finished celebrating Juneteenth on Monday of this week. It's a holiday, a federal holiday, acknowledging the abolition of slavery, the lifting of the chains of slavery in this country for all citizens. And I am a member of the Town of Vienna Baha'i community that has expanded the Juneteenth celebration into a month-long celebration called Liberty Amendments Month, which we're currently celebrating. And this is a celebration of the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 19th Amendments and what those amendments meant for minorities and women all over the country. And we know that this whole subject of racial unity and racial amity has a ways to go. I mean, we know from what we see on television, from what we read, that the problems that existed during the life of Louis Gregory have not been completely removed, and that we still have a challenge as Baha'is to continue to wave the banner of racial amity and to continue his good work. So welcome to this presentation. The title is Like Unto Pure Gold, Acceptable in Any Market and Current in Every Country, a quote from NOVA Baha'i. With each of these presentations on heroes and heroines, I put up this slide, which is a quote from Janet Rousseau's A Love Which Does Not Wait, which was published, I believe, in 1998, I'm sorry. And it describes the elements or the qualities or characteristics of a Baha'i hero or heroine. And I would like to read it to you because I could tell you, having gone through the research on Louis Gregory, he meets every one of these qualifications, every one of them. They had varying degrees of education, different levels of intellectual attainment. They died far from home while working with one common purpose: to establish the Baha'i reality of peace through unity among all people. Within this purpose, they shared a rare attribute which enabled them to do their work under the most adverse conditions with incomparable grace. They were transformed and animated by a love which does not wait. But rushes forth to serve unburdened by expectation of reward, unfreighted with selfish concerns. They were truly Baha'is, followers of Baha'u'llah, light bearers. The source of their light may have seemed obscure to much of the world, but to them it was as apparent as the sun. So this is a very important quote. And I relied pretty heavily for this presentation on two books. One of them is To Move the World, which was published in 1982. It's a Gail Morrison book. By the way, she is the definitive biographer of Louis Gregory. You'll find not only this book available to you, but also a multitude of articles that she wrote on the life of Louis Gregory. So if anyone wants to know the details, that's the person to go to, and the books to and articles to refer to. To Move the World, published in 1982. And then a more recent book, Champions of Oneness, Louis Gregory and His Shining Circle, again written by Janet Russo, who wrote the book about a love that cannot wait or does not wait. And this book, with Louis at the center of the discussion, talks about everyone in his circle, the people around him who were part of his efforts to bring race unity, particularly to the South and to other parts of the country. People like, I don't know if you know this, but Pocahontas Pope. Has anybody ever heard that name before? Pocahontas Pope is the first Baha'i in Washington, D.C. Pocahontas Pope. Roy Wilhelm, who was side by side a teacher with Louis Gregory in the Southern States, and eventually became a member of the National Spiritual Assembly and also a hand of the cause with Louis Gregory, and a number of other people. So if you want to know about the people surrounding Louis, and there's a lot in there about Louis as well, you can refer to this book, Champions of Oneness. And there were a lot of other articles that I referred to, and they're all in the references at the end of the presentation. So please take a look at those references and delve into the subject matter yourself. Now, I decided I'm going to start this with a poem. And the poem is not from Louis Gregory. The poem is from another African-American. I don't know why I keep doing this. Another African-American by the name of Robert Hayden. Has anybody ever heard of Robert Hayden? Anyone?
Yes.
Okay, great. Robert Hayden, oddly enough, I lived in the city of Falls Church in the late 70s, mid to late 70s, and served on the local spiritual assembly there. And it just so happened to be a period when Robert Hayden was also living in the city of Falls Church and serving on the assembly. So I was very honored that to have served with him and his wife Irma in the city of Falls Church. At the time, I didn't know very much about him, and quite frankly, we were so heavily involved in Baha'i activities that I really didn't delve into his profession. Someone told me that he was an advisor to the Library of Congress on the subject of poetry, which was really playing down his role. He was really the poet laureate
Right.
of the Library of Congress, the poet laureate. He is the expert on poetry advising the Library of Congress. And he was only in the area for a few years, 76 through 78. And therefore had to live in nearby, which was the city of Falls Church. And I went into some of his poetry for this presentation, and The Angle of Ascent contained a poem that I thought was very apropos because it delivers a message at the end of it, which coincides with what Louis Gregory's message was. And I thought it'd be wise to lay the groundwork with this poem. In Words in the Morning Time, he's talking about his reaction to the assassination of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. He says, for Robert Kennedy, destroyed by those they could not save. For Kennedy, I mourn. And for America, self-destructive, self-betrayed. I grieve, yet know the vanity of grief through the power of the blessed exile's transilluminating word. Aware of how these deaths, how all the agonies of our deathbed, childbed age, our process, major means whereby, oh dreadfully, our humanness must be achieved. This moved me tremendously just thinking about Louis Gregory, because his childhood was tumultuous. The challenges of his childhood, as you will see, could have led him in a different direction, and almost did. And he tells us, Louis Gregory, that no matter what we go through, the will of God will prevail, that the unity that the Baha'i Faith strives for will be achieved, and that it's all a matter of process. It's all a matter of learning It's all a matter of shedding the veils that keep us from becoming truly human. So I thought this was very apropos. Let's talk about the early years. The pictures depicted on this slide are a picture of the turn of the century Charleston, South Carolina, and a picture of Louis Gregory's mother, Mary Elizabeth Gregory. South Carolina, first of all, let's talk about the Reconstruction. His life occurred with his birth on June 6, 1874, in the post-Civil War Reconstruction period of Charleston, South Carolina. A very difficult time. As you may know from your reading of history, President Lincoln, of course, emancipated the slaves, emancipated the African Americans, he thought, through his Emancipation Proclamation. But what followed was the Reconstruction period, during which there was a deliberate attempt to undo what Abraham Lincoln started, by making it difficult for African Americans to live in a white society, to vote, to participate in activities within their own communities, to receive a proper education, so forth and so on. All kinds of efforts to disenfranchise the African American community in these white communities. Disenfranchisement included poll taxes, very strenuous and difficult identification requirements at the polls, separate entrances for blacks and whites, blacks having to sit in the back of buses and trains and inhale the fumes and the toxic flames of transportation, school systems that clearly were segregated. Everything was segregated. The school systems in particular were segregated. And we're going to get into one case toward the very end of Lewis's life, where he actually is involved in trying to change the educational scene in South Carolina before his death. But a very difficult time in Reconstruction period, Charleston, South Carolina. South Carolina was a place where most slaves brought into the country passed through or stayed. It was kind of a pass-through place for slaves to be sent to various other locations. So it was the hotbed of slavery, Charleston, South Carolina. And he was born to African-American parents liberated during the American Civil War, whose number included his future stepfather, First Sergeant George Gregory. His mother was Mary Elizabeth, and she adopted the middle name of Elizabeth in commonplace language. And her mother, Mariah, also Mary Mariah Baycott, was wholly of African blood, coming from one of the tribes, stolen by an enslaver by the name of George Washington Dargan of Rough Fork Plantation in Darlington, South Carolina. Darlington's right outside of Charleston. And not only was he the enslaver of the grandmother of Louis Gregory, but he actually fathered the mother. Mary Elizabeth was the daughter of the African mother, Mariah Baycott, and the enslaver plantation owner, George Washington Dargan. So right from the start, slavery has had its impact on Lewis's life. Despite the unsettled post-war conditions in Darlington, Elizabeth was able to obtain rudimentary education. While still a teenager, she married Ebenezer E.F. George, a blacksmith. The couple's household in Darlington included their first son, Theodore Augustus, born in 1869, and Elizabeth's mother, Mariah, living in the same household with Louis, Theodore, Ebenezer, and herself, Mary Elizabeth. In early 1870s, they moved from Darlington to Charleston, South Carolina, and they had the second son was born, Louis. Mariah was a nurse. Mariah, the grandmother, was a nurse on what is called Elysian Fields Plantation in Darlington in Rough Fork, owned by Mr. Dargan. Dargan was a cotton farmer, a lawyer, a state senator, and a judge, and he died in 1859 at the age of 56, so rather young, leaving an estate that included some 119 slaves on 2 plantations that he owned. Maria and Elizabeth were not sold off and separated, as often occurred when a planter's estate was settled. They remained slaves on the Elysian fields until the end of the Civil War, 1861, 1865 period, when they were emancipated. So they become emancipated. However, their story isn't ended. Their agony isn't ended. Although the city offered opportunities for work and education, the George family experienced hard times. When Gregory was 4 years old, Ebenezer died of tuberculosis. Elizabeth, Maria, Louis, and a brother, Theodore, went to live with Ebenezer's father, Louis's paternal grandfather. And Louis, at the age of 7, witnessed his grandfather being beaten publicly and lynched by whites, jealous of his success. Elizabeth remarried in 1881 to George Gregory, again a first sergeant in the U.S. color troops. He was honorifically called colonel to his friends and to family, and after the Civil War, he received a pension as being a soldier in the Union Army. He was a leader in the community, playing a significant role in the Brotherhood of Carpenters Union. At this point, Louis Gregory took the name of his stepfather. And having lost his real father at the age of 4, he retained really very few memories of his father, but his natural father, but he recalled the deep poverty into which the family soon plunged as a result of Ebenezer passing away. And during the first chaotic years of freedom, Mariah's husband, this is the grandmother, prospered enough to buy a horse and a mule. But now this is the husband, prospered enough to buy a horse and a mule, but his success attracted the anger of white supremacist Ku Klux Klan. And one night, the Klan members rode up to his house, called him outside, and killed him. After debating whether to shoot into the house and kill the woman, Mariah too, they decided against it and rode away. So, he lost his father, he lost his paternal grandfather. So he saw a lot of hurt. He had 3 major influences, and of course, these are the 3 family members. His grandmother, Louis, learned to face challenges and hardships with courage, dignity, resourcefulness, and a sense of humor. She would tell stories of plantation life that made him helpless with laughter. From his mother, who worked as a tailor to support her family, and Louis learned that trade, by the way, and he used that trade later on to help bring in income for himself when he wasn't practicing law. Louis admired her refined sensibilities and a love of learning. And his stepfather had the most impression on him, George Gregory. He was a freeborn native of Charleston from a property-holding family, a Union Army veteran, a carpenter by trade, and a widower. And Gregory rescued Louis's family from destitution by marrying Elizabeth, raised and educated his 2 stepsons, gave them his surname. And yet George Gregory remained a real father to Louis and to stepchildren from a subsequent marriage with the Noisettes, creating a family ties of affection that remained strong even after his death in 1929. He was active in community affairs. He relied on Louis to meet with children of Civil War soldiers who visited his father's home, and over 1,000 of both races attended George's funeral. He was very, very popular. And I think Louis, in meeting with those children of Civil War soldiers, learned to communicate, learned to associate with others. And that it really gave him a skill that enabled him to do the kind of teaching and administrative work and promotion of race unity that he did in later years. So he started him off on his spiritual journey. The education. Now, we talked at the beginning about varying degrees of education among the heroes. Louis was lucky from an education perspective. Unlucky to the extent that there were no white universities or colleges or schools that were open to him in South Carolina. But he went to some really good schools. They were open to Black students. He belonged to the first generation of African Americans in the South to have a legal right to education. He attended state-run primary schools and later studied at private institutions established by white missionaries to educate the most promising young African Americans, those who came to be known as the talented 10th, to use the phrase coined by W.E.B. Du Bois, a famed philosopher whose wife was a Baha'i, as a matter of fact. Gregory received his secondary education at Avery Normal Institute, the first private school for African Americans in Charleston to provide college preparatory curriculum. So he went to a magnet school for African American youth as a secondary education. His education was paid for up through the first year of college by his stepfather, Gregory, George Gregory. He graduated in June 1891 from Avery Normal Institute. By the way, he was at the top of his class, and he gave the commencement speech. And as I've read, his picture is still in the classroom that he occupied at that institute. They still have a framed picture of Louis Gregory as being an excellent student at the Avery Normal Institute. So he graduated in 1891, shortly before his mother's death, and then attended Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, where he earned a bachelor's degree in 1896. And a lot of African Americans attended Fisk University. It is essentially a Black university. So he attended that university, graduated. After teaching a few years at Avery, after he graduated from college, he decided to become a lawyer. His choice of career required leaving the South to do that. The region offered African Americans no opportunities to study the law, so he was not admitted to any of the schools in South Carolina or anywhere else in the South in the post-construction period. Virtually, there was no possibility of employment in the legal field. They were not employing Black lawyers in the South at the time. In 1899, he enrolled in the School of Law of Howard University, an historically Black university in Washington, D.C. He received his LLB degree in March of 1902, one of 20 graduates from the law school, all male, no women. In 1902, he gave the commencement address. Here's another school that Lewis is giving the commencement address, entitled The Growth of Peace Laws, in which he focused on disarmament, international peace initiatives. He was admitted to the bar of the District of Columbia in October 1902, and along with another lawyer, James Cobb, he opened a law office in DC. Cobb, who later became Assistant U.S. Attorney in Washington and a judge of the District of Columbia, a municipal court. Both men were considered rising stars in the Washington Black community. The partnership ended in 1906 after Gregory started to work in the United States Department of the Treasury, where he served as a clerk and he served as a lawyer. And his stay in the U.S. Treasury lasted 10 years. He became active in political and cultural life in the nation's capital, including as president of the Bethel Literary and Historical Society, one of the oldest African-American cultural organizations in the city. And by the way, when Abdu'l-Baha comes to Washington, D.C., he actually arranges for Abdu'l-Baha to speak at the Bethel Library and Historical Society. At the time, he was president of the organization. In 1905, the Washington Bee, a local Black newspaper with a national reach, lauded him as one of the most gifted writers and speakers in the country. He was admitted to the bar of the United States Supreme Court in March of 1907. For 15 years, Gregory practiced law, both in partnership with Cobb and in the Treasury Department, where he was promoted several times before returning to full-time private practice on his own. Now, how was he introduced to the Baha'i Faith? This is an important statement here. He says he was disillusioned by the mistreatment of African Americans in the post-Reconstruction period and what he suffered during his childhood the losses, the poverty, the challenges. Gregory felt compelled to protest racial segregation and the infringement of civil rights. His ideas, as he later described them, were radical, and he was committed to a program of fiery agitation. Those are his words. Although his mother and grandmother had been deeply religious, religion was no longer of any interest to him, and he had been seeking, he recalled many years later, but not finding the truth, and had given up. He first heard about the Baha'i Faith from a Treasury Department co-worker, a white Southerner who, although not seriously interested in the religion himself, thought Gregory would be. And Gregory had no inclination to attend a religious meeting. And in fact, he stayed away from any religious meeting until finally, late in 1907, he acquiesced to his friend's prodding by attending a meeting hosted by Pauline Hannon and her husband Joseph, who served in the community of Washington's Baha'i community. At the time, they had no local spiritual assembly. It was called a working committee instead of a local spiritual assembly, but they were members of the working committee of the Baha'i community of Washington, D.C. And they welcomed him to a meeting with unusual warmth, telling him that what he was about to hear would make possible a work that would bless humanity. Now, who was the person that delivered the talk? None other than the herald of the covenant, Lydia Getzinger, the teacher of many of our well-known Baha'is. She gave the talk. She was one of the first Western Baha'is, provided a brief but vivid historical account of the religions of the Bab and Baha'u'llah to Lewis. Confounding his own expectations, Gregory was intrigued, accepted Pauline Hannon's invitation to study the religion. She and her husband became the teachers and close friends of his. For the next year and a half, he attended meetings in their home, impressed by their freedom from racial prejudice, attracted by their beliefs, yet held back by his agnosticism. Finally, the Hannons pierced his mental veils by teaching him how to pray. A lot of Baha'is come to the faith through prayer, and they were very astute to teach him how to pray the Baha'i prayers, and that helped to hasten his adoption of the faith. When Hannons received permission in 1909 to visit Abdu'l-Baha in Palestine after he was freed from the Ottoman Empire, Gregory focused on the practice of law in D.C. because he was very dependent on the Hannons to keep his adoration of the faith going and his knowledge of the faith going. And he kind of lost interest for a while they were gone. But when they returned, he reattended meetings with them and rekindled his interest in the Baha'i faith. But he told them on July 23rd, 1909, that based upon what they told him and what he was able to read for himself and the talk of Lydia Getzinger, that he was a Baha'i. He was an adherent to the Baha'i faith. It came to him that this was the faith for him. He says, "It comes to me," he wrote to the Hannons a month later, "that I have never taken occasion to thank you specifically for all your kindness and patience, which finally culminated in my acceptance of the great truths of the Baha'i revelation. It has given me an entirely new conception of Christianity and of all religion. And with it, my whole nature seems changed for the better. It is a sane and practical religion which meets all the varying needs of life. And I hope I shall never regard it as a priceless possession." Gregory believed that in embracing the new faith, he neither set aside his commitment to race equality and social justice, nor distanced himself from those working for change. Instead, he refocused concern for the welfare of his people by placing it within the universal context, the establishment of a world order encompassing all peoples. So one of Louis Gregory's actions as a Baha'i was to confront de facto segregation in Washington, D.C., in the Washington, D.C. Baha'i community. Rather than being disaffected by the disparity between the Baha'is professed beliefs and their actions, which largely reflected customary social attitudes and practices, Gregory became an agent of change. His mission was reinforced by Abdu'l-Baha, who wrote in 1909 in reply to a letter from Gregory the following: "I hope that thou mayest become the means whereby the white and colored people shall close their eyes to racial differences and behold the reality of humanity that is the universal truth, which is the oneness of the kingdom of the human race. Rely as much as thou canst on the true one, and be thou resigned to the will of God, so that like unto a candle, thou mayest be enkindled in the world of humanity, and like a star, thou mayest shine and gleam from the horizon of reality and become the cause of guidance of both races." Now, what was going on in Washington that incited Louis Gregory's involvement, active involvement? I want to read from the Champions of Oneness, an excerpt on the subject of the Washington Baha'is. And this is not an indictment, it's just a recounting of the circumstances that prevailed in the Washington Baha'i community at the time. He says that Louis Gregory jumped right in because there was a major problem in the Baha'i community. And it took Louis to name it. He later wrote, "As soon as I become a believer, my colored friends got on my back and began to press me with troublesome questions. If this were a new religion which stood for unity, why were its devotees divided? Why did they not meet together in one place? Were the Baha'is not full of prejudice like other people? Although the African American believers welcomed people of all hues in their homes, and Joseph and Pauline Hannon did the same, the Baha'is as a whole didn't sponsor integrated public meetings. They had separate meetings for colored and for white, in accordance with the Jim Crow law and social mores of the time. Immediately after becoming a Baha'i, Louis wrote to the Hannons asking to meet with them and to have a talk about the local Baha'i attitude toward the colored believers. It is with sincere regret that I find it necessary to bring the matter up, and only because some impressions are going abroad which I fear will injure our cause among both white and colored. Abdu'l-Baha repeatedly specifically instructed the Baha'is to integrate their meetings. And of course, Baha'u'llah was very clear about oneness, to embrace this principle. Pauline Hannon had needed no instruction or urging other than her own purity and sensitivity, but many white Baha'is chose to ignore the principle that prejudice must be abolished. Or they had theories. One person even seemed to think that such a spiritual evolution or revolution was to occur in 1,000 years and not at this time. For Louis and his fellow African Americans, it couldn't happen fast enough. In fact, Louis had never chosen to go to any of the public meetings, as I mentioned. I rarely attended a meeting, he said, but went to the home of the Hannons where my friends and I were always welcome. But now that he was a Baha'i, Louis knew he had work to do. He didn't sit back and sigh because some of his fellow believers were blinkered, and he didn't let them disillusion him. The Baha'i faith was his credo and cause now. He would live by it as he understood it and serve it as he saw fit. So clearly, there were problems in the Washington community creating the unity that he so much wanted, that Abdu'l-Baha so much strove for. And he was right on it as a brand new Baha'i, trying to undo that. He started to organize Baha'i meetings, including one under the auspices of the Bethel Literary and Historical Association, a Negro organization of which he was president. In 1910, he became the first person to introduce the Baha'i faith in the Southeast. This is a milestone. The first person to introduce the Baha'i faith in the Southeast, including his native Charleston. Gregory's dedication to promoting the pivotal principle of the Baha'i faith, the oneness of humankind, was thus rooted in his life experience and temperament and confirmed by his relationship with Abdu'l-Baha. In early 1911, Gregory became the first African-American Baha'i to have the privilege of a pilgrimage at the behest of Abdu'l-Baha. Abdu'l-Baha expressly invited him to do a pilgrimage in Egypt and Palestine. He traveled to Egypt, where Abdu'l-Baha was residing at the time, and then visited the Baha'i holy places in the Ottoman Palestine. The pilgrimage not only had a profoundly transformative spiritual impact on Gregory, but provided opportunities for Abdu'l-Baha to stress the vital importance of bringing Blacks and whites together in the United States. Abdu'l-Baha said many wonderful things during my brief contact with him in Egypt, which lasted less than a fortnight. Gregory later recalled, but more than anything else, his discourse was about the American race problem. When Gregory asked Abdu'l-Baha for his guidance, Abdu'l-Baha reiterated the wish he had expressed in his letter to Gregory, urging him to work for unity and harmony between the races. So what's next for Lewis? He goes on his pilgrimage to Egypt and Palestine in March 1911, where he met not only Abdu'l-Baha, but Shoghi Effendi, who I believe at that time was still in his teens, but he had an opportunity to actually talk to Shoghi Effendi about this race issue. During the first conversation, Abdu'l-Baha immediately addressed the heart of the matter. What of the conflict between the white and colored races, he asked. The question made me smile, Gregory wrote, for I had once felt that my inquirer, although he had never in person visited America, knew more of the conditions than I could ever know. And I'm sure he did, being Abdu'l-Baha. I answered that there was much friction between the races, that those who accepted the Baha'i teachings had hopes of an amicable settlement of racial differences, while others were despondent. Among the friends were earnest souls who wished for a closer unity of races and hoped that he might point out the way to them. He further questioned, this is Abdu'l-Baha, does this refer to the removal of hatreds and antagonisms on the part of one race or both races? And the answer was both races. Both races, and Abdu'l-Baha said, this will be done, namely the removal of hatreds and antagonisms. This will be done. So Lewis knew that through his work and the work of others, eventually there would be unity of the races, because it's the will of God. He said, work for unity and harmony between the races. There must be no distinctions. He then gave blackberries, Abdu'l-Baha, to each of the pilgrims who were there at the time, which Gregory interpreted as the symbolic sharing of black-colored fruit. During this time, Abdu'l-Baha also started encouraging Gregory and another Baha'i who happened to be on the same pilgrimage, Louisa Matthew, a white English woman who was also a pilgrim, to get to know each other. Oddly enough, a year later, September the 27th, 1912, Gregory and Louisa became married. They were married, becoming the first Baha'i interracial couple. As I mentioned, Gregory also mentioned Shoghi Effendi. Now, Louisa Matthew, we're going to get into a little bit about Louisa in one of the several of the slides here. Louisa deserves a presentation on her own. I would like to devote a separate hour on Louisa Matthew Gregory sometime in the future. After leaving Egypt, Gregory traveled to Germany. By the way, I want to mention before we get into Germany that before Lewis left on his pilgrimage, and guess what? He left on a German liner, cruise liner, sailed, and the name of the cruise liner was Louise. Very odd. Louise was the name of the cruise liner he sailed on to get to the pilgrimage. Before he left, the Baha'is in the Washington community were so excited that Lewis had specifically received an invitation from Abdu'l-Baha. They gave him a big celebration before he left. When he arrived in Germany as a stopover to get to Egypt and Palestine, the Baha'is of Germany gave him a big celebration, excited to hear that a Baha'i who was invited by Abdu'l-Baha was on his way to his pilgrimage. So he returns to Germany, travels there before returning to the US, where he spoke at a number of gatherings to Baha'is and their friends. When he returned to the United States, he continued to travel throughout the southern part of the country, talking about the faith. I don't think there is a single person in the faith who has had as much travel in the southern states, maybe all the states of the Union, as Louis Gregory throughout his 40 plus years as a Baha'i. Several times he went to almost every state in the South to talk about the faith, and under the most onerous conditions of prejudice, poverty, so forth and so on. During his travels, whenever he was accompanied by his wife, they received a range of different reactions because interracial marriage was illegal and unrecognized in the majority of the states at the time. You heard of the anti-miscegenation laws, which forbade in most of the states at the time, and for a long time, even in the state of Virginia, we know from the Loving case, forbade whites and blacks to marry and to commingle in their states. And at that time, this was the prevailing mores of the southern states and most states. So it was very difficult for Louise to be seen with Louis throughout the travels. And you will see later on, you will find out that Louise spent a good deal of her life teaching in Europe. And I thought to myself when I heard that she's spending most of the year in Europe teaching, and Louis is spending most of the year, except for summers, in the United States teaching. Why did that occur? What kind of a marriage life was that? But you have to realize that she was somewhat impeding Louis's efforts to teach in the South by being with him because of the impressions that she was making in a community where blacks and whites should not be joining together. So there may have been a conscious effort on the part of the couple to not be roadblocks to teaching effectively by separating their teaching efforts and acting independently, although she was a very independent woman. In 1912, during Abdu'l-Baha's visit to the United States, Gregory organized speaking engagements at Howard University for Abdu'l-Baha, at the Metropolitan AME Church, again bringing the Bethel Society, utilizing the Metropolitan Church for the Bethel Society to allow Abdu'l-Baha to speak. A year later, Abdu'l-Baha stood upon the wooden stage in Rankin Chapel at Howard University in front of 1,600 students, faculty, and guests, speaking with Louis Gregory at his side. Now, Rankin Chapel has a story unto itself. Many years ago, maybe close to 10 years ago, I had the great opportunity of attending a commemoration of Abdu'l-Baha's visit in the Rankin Chapel. And the minister of the chapel came out and talked about the history of the chapel and told us all that shortly after Abdu'l-Baha's visit to the Rankin Chapel, there was a fire in the chapel that almost virtually devastated the chapel. And it took them a long time to renovate that chapel. And the first event that occurred after the renovation was complete was the commemoration of the visit of Abdu'l-Baha to Rankin Chapel. I thought that was very, very interesting. But Rankin Chapel was a place that was arranged for Abdu'l-Baha to speak to 1,600 people during their lifetimes together. Bear with me here. I'm having a difficult time moving the slides. Here we go. Now, a little bit about the marriage to Louisa. In furtherance of convention and the mores of the time, Abdu'l-Baha encouraged the marriage of Louis and Louise, who was, again, a white English Baha'i from Europe, who was a very effective teacher. Here's an interesting fact, too, coming up. She happened to be on the pilgrimage with Louis, okay, at the same time, which, of course, gave Abdu'l-Baha the opportunity to pair these two together. But she was also on the SS Cedric, the luxury liner that was occupied by Abdu'l-Baha when he made his trip to the United States. She was on the Cedric with Abdu'l-Baha. An interesting fact. And I'm going to jump the gun. I say this for a question later on, but I'm going to jump the gun and see if I can find it here. It's in this book, To Move the World, about the two of them getting together in this pilgrimage. Bear with me. Actually, it's in the other one. It's in the Champions of Oneness. This is what the author says about the two getting together. The question that I saved for you at the very end is, do you think Abdu'l-Baha knew that these two would get together when they arrived for their pilgrimage? Do you think he was able to foretell that the two would be married? It's hard to tell, but this is what the author says about that subject. This is, again, Janet Russo says, knowing Abdu'l-Baha's encouragement of variegated families and his intuitive trust in Louis and Louisa, of which we'll see ample proof, it is interesting to consider whether or not he engineered their meeting. In afterthought, they believed he did. Like Louisa had to put off her pilgrimage until it just happened to coincide with Louis. So she had a different pilgrimage planned. And circumstances arose that made it necessary for her to reschedule her pilgrimage, and it just happened to coincide with Louis's pilgrimage. Did the master foresee this? Did he foresee, even in Ramallah, that Louis Gregory and Louisa Matthew would form a union of equals in which each nurtured the other's soul while braving a prejudiced society that could have destroyed them? Did he foresee how they would each follow, while maintaining their unity, an individual path of service with such passion and purity that Louis would posthumously be named Hand of the Cause of God, and Louisa hailed as faithful, consecrated handmaiden of Abdu'l-Baha? So she's raising the issue, and clearly she's saying that the two believed that it was engineered by Abdu'l-Baha. They truly believed that this was not merely a coincidence. So although Abdu'l-Baha had raised the topic of intermarriage during their visit to Egypt, telling Gregory, if you have any influence to get the races to intermarry, it'll be very valuable. At first, they thought of each other only as friends. When they met again in America, Abdu'l-Baha urged them to consider their relationship in a new light. Only then did the potential attachment he had sensed between them blossom into love. They were married in the quiet ceremony that I mentioned in New York City, 27 September 1912, becoming again the first interracial Baha'i couple at a time when interracial marriage in the United States defied popular scientific theories about the baneful effects of racial mixing, flouted the customary dictates of a divided society, and was a criminal offense in much of the nation. So Abdu'l-Baha described the Gregories as an introduction to the accomplishment of fellowship between the races. Although the couple had no children of their own, they enriched the lives of many young people, and over the years became a particular source of strength to a growing number of interracially married couples among the American Baha'is. We're going to find that Louis was very active in trying to undo these anti-miscegenation laws. One Baha'i couple in Washington, a Black man and a white woman who had converted from Christianity to the Baha'i Faith, were actually committed to an asylum by their families because of the insane effort to, first of all, convert to the Baha'i Faith, and secondly, to marry in a mixed race relationship. They were committed to an asylum. So you can see how people were reacting to this whole concept of mixed racial marriages at that time. So Abdu'l-Baha visits the United States a year later, in 1912, continuing his close relationship with Gregory. He visits North America, and Gregory was instrumental in arranging for two major speaking engagements for Abdu'l-Baha. As was mentioned, the event at Rankin Chapel, 1,600 people attending, and a large gathering of people hosted by the Bethel Literary and Historical Association at the Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church, which I believe, in fact, I think I've seen it. I think it's on M Street in Northwest Washington. Because I remember trying to get into it, and at the time the custodian said that it was not open, would not allow me to go in and take a look at it, but it still exists in DC. So he arranged for those two events for Abdu'l-Baha. And then this is the most famous event, an invitation by Abdu'l-Baha to an event that was arranged by Ali Quli Khan, a Baha'i who was charged d'affaires of the Persian litigation, and his wife, Madame Florence Breed Khan, held at his home in Washington. There was a luncheon planned and a reception, and about 19 socially prominent guests, including dignitaries from the government, invited. Abdu'l-Baha defied both Washington Protocol and the conventions of racial segregation by insisting that Gregory join him at this event by adding a place for Gregory immediately to his right in the seat of honor. Now, what happened here, we're going to get into detail a little bit more in the next slide. Louis Gregory went to the reception, and then realizing that the people that were invited were so above him, they were so important, that he was an embarrassment to be there, being a Black person, decided to walk away after the reception and not attend the dinner. So he's an African-American lawyer who was a leader in efforts to build race unity. Lewis said the spiritual atmosphere during the talk raised his hearers to a pitch of joyous enthusiasm. The audience applauded repeatedly as Abdu'l-Baha spoke, and long afterward. So what happened? After the reception with Abdu'l-Baha, Lewis, who had not, well, I'm not sure this is true, he was not invited to the luncheon, waited for a chance to slip out quietly, but Abdu'l-Baha led the way to the dining room for others. According to the tradition, the seats at the table were carefully arranged based on each person's position in society. But when everyone was seated, Abdu'l-Baha suddenly stood up and looked around, and he said to Ali Quli Khan, "Where is Mr. Gregory? Bring Mr. Gregory." And Ali Quli Khan immediately went out of the room, went to find Lewis, found him outside, brought him in. Meanwhile, Abdu'l-Baha, in his absence, rearranged the place settings that had been so formally laid out. He put Lewis in the place of honor at his right. Lewis was the only African-American person there. By welcoming him warmly and giving him a prominent seat, Abdu'l-Baha demonstrated that people of all races should be treated equally. He said he was happy to have Lewis there, and during lunch he spoke about the oneness of humanity. And Lewis later wrote that Abdu'l-Baha made everyone feel perfectly at ease by his great humor, wisdom, and outpouring of love. He also said that Abdu'l-Baha's heart seemed to be a mysterious and boundless treasury of love. So this is probably one of the most popular events, one of the most well-known events in the life of Louis Gregory, that Abdu'l-Baha made him the centerpiece, made him the person sitting at his right-hand side during this meeting of dignitaries. 7 months later, Abdu'l-Baha made his second visit to Washington. The Baha'is organized a banquet at Rogers Hall at Howard University that was attended by some 300 people. It was the first interracial social event ever held by Baha'is in the nation's capital city. So you see some progress there, an interracial social event where there were no such events, no doubt brought on by Abdu'l-Baha's visit. We must lay aside all prejudice, whether it be religious, racial, political, or patriotic. We must become the cause of the unification of the human race, Abdu'l-Baha says. When he spoke these words in 1912, the concept of unity among all races was new. Racial segregation was common. In the South, it was legal to separate schools, buses, parks, and other facilities based on race. During a 9-month tour of the US and Canada, Abdu'l-Baha gave public talks to thousands of people. He shared the Baha'i teachings about the oneness of humanity and urged his audiences to establish true unity. At his talk to over 1,000. At his talk I just talked to over 1,000 people at Howard University. He says, I am very happy that white and blacks have gathered together in this meeting. I hope this coming together and harmony reaches such a degree that no distinction shall remain between them, and they shall be together in the utmost harmony and love. Now, we're going to get into the roles that Louis Gregory took on as a Baha'i, the major roles. He worked in 3 separate but interrelated fields to promote the oneness of humankind. He was a teacher, he was an administrator, he was a promoter of racial unity. He devoted himself to teaching the Baha'i Faith, particularly among the African Americans. We've heard about his efforts in Washington, D.C., attracting the interest of professionals and intellectuals. The need to accommodate them spurred the Washington Baha'is to begin reconsidering practices based on racial prejudice and to commence the long spasmodic process, okay, and I emphasize process, the growing process of becoming humane and human, of rooting out these prejudices. Although it will be many years before the community overcame overt racial barriers, Louis Gregory's activities as a new Baha'i led to the holding of some integrated meetings, paving the way for many interracial gatherings during Abdu'l-Baha's visit. So the interracial Baha'i activities began prior to Abdu'l-Baha's visit due to Louis Gregory's efforts and continued during his visit and beyond. On his teaching trips to the South in 1910 and 1915, Gregory found African Americans to be deeply and vitally interested in the Baha'i message. As a Southerner, a graduate of Avery, Fisk, and Howard, a recognized member of the so-called African American intelligentsia, and an eloquent speaker, he was welcomed as a lecturer at numerous Black schools and colleges, churches, and social organizations in the South. In 1916, responding to 5 letters of Abdu'l-Baha's divine plan, summoning the Baha'is to disseminate the Baha'i faith throughout the continent and the world, Gregory responded to Abdu'l-Baha by traveling extensively for about 6 weeks in the fall of 1916. He spoke to an estimated 15,000 people. He returned to Washington determined to free himself for more travel. With Louise's full agreement, even though she was seldom able to travel with him because of the constraints of a racially divided society, clearly we have evidence of the fact that the decision to independently teach was motivated by the constraints of a racially divided society. He closed his law practice and a real estate firm that he had just established, and turned down a position on the law faculty of Howard University to do what? To devote himself entirely to teaching the faith. This was in 2016. He had a long road to go. His life lasted for another 30 to 40 years, and he ceased his regular profession to devote himself to teaching, which created economic problems for him. But somehow he had the Midas touch, and he was able to draw people to him to receive contributions, to raise money through his own tailoring efforts. He did tailoring on the side, and subsidizations from the institutions of the faith to be able to continue in his efforts and to prosper. Gregory's journeys continued, concentrated primarily in the South, although he visited 46 states, as well as parts of Canada. Gradually, a pattern evolved. He would travel during winter, sometimes interrupted by weeks or months devoted to administrative and organizational activity in the North, and spend summers, if possible, with Louise. At first, their home base continued to be Washington. Later, they lived in New England, in Greater Boston, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and Eliot, Maine, where they ended up at the very end of their lives. They especially enjoyed participating in summer classes and conferences at Greenacre Baha'i School in Eliot, where their activities provided a respite from the periods of enforced separation that Lewis's work entailed. So getting together was a respite from the virtually year-long separation that they had to endure because of everything they encountered in their efforts to teach. In 1920, writing to a woman who had met Lewis in Texas, Abdu'l-Baha paid him a remarkable tribute. He said, "That pure soul has a heart like unto transparent water. He is like unto pure gold. That is why he is acceptable in any market and is current in every country." He was a teacher. He was an influencer. Now he's beginning to influence some important people, especially in the African American community, not in the white community. You know, he went on his journey in 1921, a coast-to-coast trip, the longest he ever made, and at the time it was heralded as an achievement unsurpassed in the history of the North American Baha'i community. So traveling 46 states, his coast-to-coast travels, virtually every one of the southern states, multiple times, one of the most traveled Baha'i teachers in Baha'i history. As a lecturer, author, organizer, he ensured that the Baha'i Faith came to the attention of a considerable portion of the African American public and of a number of progressive whites in the first half of the 20th century. Several well-known African Americans became Baha'is, including Robert Abbott, publisher of the Chicago Defender newspaper, Nina Gomer Dubois, first wife of the scholar activist W.E.B. Du Bois, very famous W.E.B. Du Bois, who eventually became president of the NAACP and a philosopher, writer on the subject of interracial relations. His wife was a Baha'i. John Burke's Dizzy Gillespie, I'm sure everybody has heard that name, world-renowned jazz trumpeter who was impressed with Louis Gregory's teachings, and a composer. And then Alain Locke, Howard University philosopher and dean of the so-called Harlem Renaissance, who was a Baha'i. And I happened to go through the Baha'i world to find things on Louis Gregory, and I found more things about Alain Locke, including articles that he wrote in Baha'i World than I found on Louis Gregory. But I did find some things that I'll share with you. But Alain Locke, a very famous African-American in the Washington, D.C. area, who happened to join Louis Gregory on many of the travel teaching efforts and served in the Washington Baha'i community. Through the efforts of Louis Gregory and his associates, the Baha'i teachings would have an important leavening effect on the emerging movement for racial justice in America. He wrote to W.E.B. Du Bois in the 1930s, stating that the new religion, the Baha'i Faith, was the means of transforming hearts and erasing racism. Were the Baha'i Faith merely a cult with a human origin, it could attract only people who shared its views. Its mysterious power is indicated by its ability to transform people whose views are diametrically opposed to the ideals and to give them new minds and new hearts. So the effect of the faith on people that he spoke to showed that it was an important message even for those who disagreed with him, not only those who adopted the Baha'i principles. After making the decision to give up his law practice, Louise and Gregory paid for his travels, sorry about that, with their personal resources, including the proceeds from the sale of their home that served as their refuge from discrimination. After their funds were depleted, he accepted financial assistance from the Friends, and for more than a decade, a monthly subsidy from the Baha'i Fund, a necessity with which he was never comfortable. The termination of that subsidy in January 1933, during the depths of the Great Depression, tested him personally for a time, but did not deter him from his work, to which he had long been completely committed. For nearly 3 decades, from 1917 until 1946, he persevered as an itinerant Baha'i teacher, despite meager means and difficult, degrading traveling conditions. What traveling conditions? Not finding places to stay that were open to him. You heard the story about the Green Book? There's a movie called The Green Book, in which blacks had to check this book to determine what hotels and lodgings were open to blacks before they went on a trip to the South. So the same condition prevailed for Lewis, having to do his legwork to determine where he was going to stay, where he would be accepted in his trips throughout the South. Traveling at the back of buses and trains. There was one story of being invited to a university to speak, And the university was delighted that he consented to the invitation. And he sent a group of students, the university sent a group of students to pick him up at the train station. And when the students arrived at the train station to pick him up and saw that he was black, they never got out of the car. They turned around and drove back to the university, never letting the university know that he was not picked up and never letting the university know why he was not picked up. So he sat there and eventually called the university, and the university realized there was a problem and sent somebody out there to get him. But these are the kinds of things he encountered. Another practice, of course, that you probably have heard about is that when you walk down the street as a black in this period in the South and whites are walking on the same sidewalk, you have to step off the curb and walk off the sidewalk to allow the whites to walk the sidewalk. And it's in the research that I found that when Lewis encountered that, he told the Baha'is, don't worry about it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to step off the curb every time the circumstances arise, because that's what it takes to keep racial unity going. He did not defy them. He followed the mores. Not being able to mix with women. There's a story later on about trying to arrange some firesides with two white women, and after making the arrangements, having a picnic on a beach, and being chided by one of the Baha'is for risking his life by being seen with white women. I mean, there were all kinds of problems, but Louis Gregory defied those problems and was there multiple times teaching the faith as best he could. In the winter of 1931, he embarked on a teaching trip in the American South with William McKay, a white person. They visited Atlanta, Georgia, Tuskegee, Montgomery, and Huntsville, Alabama, Nashville, Tennessee, Louisville, Kentucky, Cincinnati, Ohio, speaking at a number of churches and colleges and other venues, offering a perspective on the situation of race at the time. As far as the state and local ordinances made it possible, the two Baha'is shared all things together as if both were members of the same race. Participating in one of the first interracial teaching trips in the South, he responded to a call by Shoghi Effendi for intensive teaching. He stayed in Nashville, Tennessee, until there was enough Baha'is to form its first local administrative body. So he actually ended up staying in Tennessee to await the creation of the first working committee or local spiritual assembly of Nashville, Tennessee. More teacher. In 1922, Louise began spending more time in Europe, where she supported herself by teaching music, English, and Esperanto, helped form Baha'i communities in a number of countries, including Bulgaria and Yugoslavia. And she was the first, this is an important fact, Louise was the first Baha'i pioneer in both Yugoslavia and Bulgaria. And she was the first teacher to arrive in Hungary and Austria since Abdu'l-Baha's visit in those countries in 1913. So she was opening up Europe as Lewis was in the South, in the United States, opening up the American South. Shortly after Louise's return from the Balkans in 1936, the Gregorys responded to a new call by Shoghi Effendi to establish the Baha'i Faith in every country of the Americas. They sailed to Haiti in January of 1937. So he had already been to Europe teaching. He had been in Egypt and Palestine. He had been in parts of Canada. He had been all over the United States. And now he and his wife are traveling to Haiti in 1937 to teach the faith, planning to spend at least 3 months, but they were driven out by the government of Haiti, which was very pro-Catholic. It was a very pro-Catholic, predominantly Catholic country. And the government could not tolerate the teaching of the Baha'i Faith in the country, and they asked him to leave the country. And he left in April of 1937, sailed for New York, hoping that the official attitude would change and allow them to return. He never got a chance to return. That year marked the beginning of the 7-year plan, the first of several plans devised by Shoghi Effendi for the expansion of the faith. With doors in Haiti having shut, Louis Gregory resumed his speaking tours throughout the U.S., but also focused on building Baha'i communities in 6 states in the South that had no resident Baha'is. During the winter of 1937-1938, he spent several months at the Tuskegee Institute, an historically Black institution of higher education in Tuskegee, Alabama. In 1939, he went to Pine Bluff, Arkansas, the location of another historically Black college, remained for a month of intensive activity. Over the next several years, even though World War II made traveling difficult, he visited numerous college campuses in the South, white and Black, as well as in border states and the Midwest. So an intensive and ceaseless effort to teach the faith throughout the United States, despite obstacles along the way. Now, that explains his teaching role. What about administrator? Louis Gregory made significant contributions, not only to teaching the Baha'i faith, but he was also involved in Baha'i activity as administrator. He was first elected in February 1911 to fill a vacancy on the working committee of Washington, D.C. So he served on what would have been the local spiritual assembly starting in February of 1911. And on April the 30th, 1912, during the National Baha'i Convention attended by Abdu'l-Baha, Gregory was elected to the executive board of the Baha'i Temple Unity, the governing body in North America at the time. The first and one of the few African Americans elected to the national leadership in any interracial organization in the first half of the 20th century, he served on the National Spiritual Assembly for 14 years, 1922 to 24, 27 to 32, and 1939 to 46, with very many distinguished Baha'is. You see a picture at the top. That is a picture of one of the National Spiritual Assemblies he served on. And you could see from the names, there are some rather famous Baha'is that served on that National Spiritual Assembly with him. Amelia Collins, Dorothy Baker, Horace Holly, Roy Wilhelm, Leroy Iwas, all of whom were not only members of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States, but along with Lewis were hands of the cause of God. And this is just one of the National Spiritual Assemblies. So you go back, you're going to find that many of the Baha'is that we know of in Baha'i history served with Louis Gregory on the National Spiritual Assembly. Several times he received the highest or second highest number of votes cast. He filled a number of administrative roles on the assembly, becoming its first recording secretary. So he was the first recording secretary of the National Baha'i Assembly of the United States, an office he held for 6 years, and he helped to draft the bylaws of the National Baha'i Assembly of the United States, which became the model for the charters of all national spiritual assemblies throughout the world. In 1927, he was appointed to serve on the National Committee on Interracial Amity and became its executive secretary, and began to plan a lot of race amity conferences throughout the country that engendered good relations between whites and blacks. He attended almost every Baha'i National Convention from 1911 until his retirement in 1946. Often he was elected convention secretary, served as convention reporter, and addressed the gathering as a featured speaker. This is a really impressive Baha'i. I mean, if you're not impressed as I am, then I need to repeat the whole presentation, because when I read this, I said, oh my God, this man is something else. What a model. What a model for the Baha'is. His third role, proponent of racial unity. And I really apologize for the number of strokes on this particular slide. It's quite lengthy and detailed, but I wanted to make sure that I captured a good picture of his role as proponent of racial unity. He served as the standard bearer in the third field, the promotion of race unity. Both Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi repeatedly called the attention of the American Baha'is to the importance of confronting this issue of racial prejudice, which was later defined as the most vital and challenging issue for Americans. Gregory led the community's response, guided by Abdu'l-Baha and his instruction to work for amity and harmony between the races. Lewis's activities became national in scope. For decades, he was the preeminent Baha'i writer, lecturer, and organizer on this theme. You'll see articles galore in the Baha'i world on the subject of race amity. And some of them I have referred to in the references, so take a look at them. In the North, conferences and other activities sponsored or co-sponsored by the Baha'is resulted in a significant public role for the religion in the fields of race relations and civil rights. These events provided a platform for the exchange of views by outstanding leaders, white and black, among them W.E.B. Du Bois, who I mentioned as being a philosopher and NAACP president, an executive director of the NAACP, James Weldon Johnson, Jane Addams, who was the foremost proponent of women's suffrage at the time, and activities for women and race relations from a female perspective. Roy Wilkins, who was also an executive of the NAACP. All these individuals were enlightened by Louis Gregory, though they were not Baha'is. And distinguished Baha'is, as I mentioned, Elaine Locke, Dorothy Baker, Sarah Martin Pereira. Does anybody remember Sarah Martin Pereira from the Washington, D.C. community? I remember as a young Baha'i first arriving in 1970, was it 74 in the Washington area, meeting Sarah Martin Pereira. She was a counselor, and she bore the fruits of the teaching of Louis Gregory. I didn't know that. She was one of his disciples and followers. And then Horace Holly. Horace Holly, by the way, again, member of the National Baha'i Assembly and also Hand of the Cause, reports in one of these two books that he likens the role of Louis Gregory to the role of the early Baha'i believers, Persian believers, because of the challenges that he faced of having to introduce the faith to people that never heard of it, and bearing animosity and confrontation and persecution at the hands of those he tried to share the faith with, that it was comparable to the role of the early Persian believers. Gregory frequently served behind the scenes as an organizer or a publicist, and sometimes took a more visible role as a chairperson or speaker of many of the events that he spoke at. Once, while visiting Miami, I mentioned this before, he and two white women from the North arranged a series of Baha'i meetings, firesides, attracting people of both races, followed by sightseeing and a picnic in the white section of town. Afterwards, a friend chided him for not realizing how dangerous it was to be seen with white women on this beach. Gregory replied that having been born and reared in the South, he knew its customs well, about as well as Brer Rabbit in the Briar Patch. If anybody knows about the Song of the South, Disney's Song of the South, the character of Brer Rabbit in the South and his Briar Patch, he was quoting that from the Disney movie, but found his protection in God. If he does not hold me, I am unsafe anywhere. That's quite a quote. If he does not hold me, I am unsafe anywhere. In 1932, for example, as secretary of the Baha'i National Committee for Race Amity, Gregory responded to a local spiritual assembly that instructed a community member to channel her enthusiasm for promoting race unity into holding a study class for colored people in her home. He cautioned the assembly to reconsider the action that would be foredoomed, yet he declined to make racial attitudes a litmus test of faith. He says, and this is important, my observation, he wrote to a friend, is that many whites are unconscious of their prejudices, and many colored people reflect, consciously or otherwise, the prejudices of the whites. He believed that overcoming prejudice requires effort, patience, and acknowledgement of the sincerity of others, even if their views may clash with ours, but that the Baha'i faith, if adhered to, will inevitably train people out of their prejudices and insularities of thought. Again, it's a process. Going back to the poem of Robert Hayden, a process of becoming human. And the Baha'i faith is helping us to shed those obstacles and shedding those veils to become more human and more acknowledging of the oneness of humanity. Now, there's some quotes here that I'd like to read for you. The first one, this most great reconstruction, This is an interesting opening, isn't it? Given the fact that Lewis was raised during the Reconstruction that followed the Emancipation Proclamation. This most great, and I'll throw in here, spiritual reconstruction, which the majestic revelation of Baha'u'llah brings to view, is not black or white or yellow or brown or red, yet all of these. It is the power of divine outpourings and endless perfections for mankind. I sometimes let myself drift into despondency, but I'm always ashamed of it. God has given us so much, and it's provided us so much more. So many people I know are in serious difficulties that life itself would hardly seem justified were it not absolutely assured that through the present depressing conditions, the purposes of God are being fulfilled. So he's telling people, ignore what's happening to you. God has told you he's going to make it happen. Race unity is going to be a reality, and that the purposes of God are being fulfilled in their lifetime, and they just don't see it, but it's coming about. Light is everywhere, breaking for the oppressed people of the earth. Deep shadows prove the intensity of the light. The interest of no groups or classes will be overlooked or forgotten. The wish of the underprivileged to be treated as fairly as are other Americans in every avenue of individual advancement is both proper and reasonable. Untenable is the attitude of those who would withhold it because of complexion or other superficial reasons. The friends of the oppressed show rapid increase in numbers and powers, assuming that the victims of injustice will continue with their struggle. Again, the process. No human might can long debar them from their long-sought goal. Earth and air, fire and water, the stars and their courses, the high tide of destiny, and the will of divine providence are all arrayed against the forces of oppression. Very powerful statement from Louis Gregory. Now, I have 2 slides here. I want to share some insights. And hopefully I can read this. It'll be a little bit difficult. Some of your faces are showing over the slide, but what others said about Louis Gregory. And I want to share these quotes. Some of them are from Abdul Baha, some from Shoghi Effendi, but I want to share them with you. He was tall, only about 6 feet, but appearing taller because of his unusually erect carriage. When he spoke, he looked people in the eye. His beautiful, deep voice had everyone's attention. The effect of his stately bearing was enhanced by his immaculate grooming and his great courtesy. Courtly in manner, but with no affectation. What that means is that he appeared to be ready for court. He was so well presented, but he didn't do it deliberately to look good. It was just him. It was him, courtly by nature. He was invariably humble, without a trace of excessive modesty that calls attention to itself. His eyes sparkled in conversation. His smile was always ready. He had extraordinary personal attributes. From his youth, he was bright, multi-talented and idealistic, gifted with eloquence and a sense of humor. After becoming a Baha'i, at the age of 35, he began working consciously towards personal spiritual transformation and the achievement of deep faith, patience, and humility. Again, the process. A spiritual giant and a beacon of true humanity, a source of shimmering radiance, one recalled, that was so remarkable that it seemed to be part of him. I never saw him show anger, impatience, or resentment. Instead, when met by hostility, Gregory seemed to search his innermost being and beyond for a solution to a change in the relationship. Martha Root says, I always feel he is one of the greatest disciples of this new day. He had a mostly heavenly smile that will remain with me always. Verily, he has much advanced in his pilgrimage journey, Abdul Baha says. He received another life. Remember, before that, he was ready for radical action. He was ready for confrontation. He goes to visit Abdul Baha, and suddenly he's got another life, obtained another power. And when he returned, Gregory was quite another Gregory. He had become a new creation. In 1920, Abdul Baha paid him attribute. He says that pure soul has a heart like unto transparent water. He is like unto pure gold. That is why he is acceptable in any market and is current in every country. Shoghi Effendi says, I feel impelled to reaffirm my deep sense of indebtedness to you for your magnificent work in the service of the faith of Baha'u'llah. No words of mine can pay adequate tribute to the spirit that glows within your breasts, or to the determination that fires your soul in your unique and highly meritorious endeavors. You have attained spiritual heights that few indeed can claim to have scaled. You have displayed a spirit that few, if any, can equal. Abdu'l-Baha says, Gregory is the essence of the love of God and the symbol of guidance. How luminous is the face of this person. His character is like unto a rose garden. His face is always filled with light, as if he lived, moved, and breathed in the atmosphere of the spirit, a testimony of the purity and evanescence of this rare soul. You never tarnished by attention or by praise. Self-importance had no place in his nature. He perceived the light that others perceived in him to the powerful force of unity. By stressing the potential of any human being to become illumined, Louis Gregory deflected personal praise. He felt that no one could take credit for the results of the spiritual law of causation. Illumination did not belong to him. It is a spiritual force that could be tapped and utilized by anyone at any time. He wasn't afraid of the rigorous laws of risk of confrontation. He found his inner wisdom. He confronted problems and he consulted with the people. Also, I found out that in one of his letters to one of the Baha'is, he sent in the letter a $5 bill. And it was his practice that if he felt that the Baha'i was writing to was in need of money to survive, he added a $5 bill to the letter of correspondence because he thought that by sending that $5 bill, that person would be able to make some progress that would lead to greater progress for that individual and help him to overcome the economic problems they was facing. So he was very generous in that regard. And you have to keep in mind, this is a person who, when he stopped his law practice, wasn't making much money to begin with. So he was taking money that he was earning through tailoring, money he was receiving from the friends, from the institutions, and sharing it with others, which is a noble gesture. I would like to read to you now about a dream and move the world. It's on page 315. You just bear with me, which gives you some idea of what people thought of him. This is a dream that Charles Reed Bishop, who was the husband of a Baha'i who was close friends with Louis, had. He was a non-Baha'i who had this dream, okay? And he says, in 1927, Charles Reed Bishop, a Baha'i from West Coast, who later pioneered with his wife in Europe, okay, actually did become a Baha'i, had a dream about Louis Gregory while staying at the Gyersville Baha'i School in California. The dream was so vivid that he told his wife, Helen, about it, and the next morning, she in turn immediately recounted it to Mr. Gregory. After thanking him for a recent letter and sending regards to Louise, she wrote, Dear Louis, I know your sweet humility, but I wish to share with you an interesting dream which Charles had last night, and which brought him a marvelous wave of elation and joy. She explained that as she was looking after a child from San Francisco for the week, Mr. Bishop had given up his bed and gone to sleep alone in another cabin, where he felt an appalling loneliness. He finally, after praying, managed to go to sleep. Just before he awakened in the morning, she continued, Louis, you are walking, he says, the dream says, Louis, you're walking in the air. You are wholly unconscious of your lofty height and went serenely on, oblivious of the fact that you were in this unique station. Then he observed that you had come out of the west to the east. You were turned to attention and then faced the south and continued your course with the banner of high and shining. Then he observed that there was a fleet of airships in the north, hundreds of them filling the sky. Dear Lewis, you can interpret this as it appears to you, but the reality which came to Charles through this dream was this. You had transcended all earthly limitations, had attained an ethereal consciousness, and alone, this impressed him with an unfaltering purpose and a steady pace would in time of crisis carry the banner of Baha'u'llah's spiritual victory. So he was seeing Louis Gregory in the sky, flying, carrying the banner of Baha'u'llah, which shows you the impact that Louis Gregory had on the Baha'is. Now, let's go back up. I missed one. Bear with me. In 1946, Shoghi Effendi realized that Louis and Louise were coming of age. They were in their 70s. Louis was not in greatest health. Louise was failing of her health. And he told Louis, you've done enough. Even in the last few years, leading up to 46 and 45, Louis was travel teaching still, despite the fact that he was not in the greatest of health. And what Shoghi Effendi told him was, it's time to rest. You're settled in Green Acre. Your home is there. It's time to stop travel teaching and just take it easy. So both he and Louise decided to begin their retirement, so to speak, from active teaching, not from active teaching, but travel teaching, because his teaching still never ended, even after he started to begin these years. So he instructed him to please stop travel teaching. He lived in a cottage home at the Green Acre Baha'i School. And you can see the home at the top. One of the pictures to the right, is the elderly Louis and Louise in front of their home in Green Acre, the cottage. You see on the left side, Louis Gregory among other participants at the Green Acre Baha'i School. He lived in the cottage. His doors were never locked. He had no reason to lock them. The interracial marriage was well accepted in Elliott, Maine. He was able to walk down the street hand in hand with Louise with no problem. He enjoyed being among people. He enjoyed teaching the faith. He enjoyed gardening. He and Louise learned cooking, Louisa mostly. In December 1948, Louis suffered a stroke, and the stroke required that he stay in a hospital for 18 days. At one point in his ailment and in his illness, the doctors thought he only had a few days to live, and he instructed Louise that he's not going to live much longer. But as it turned out, putting himself through rehab, he managed to overcome the effects of the stroke and to get back to health, and was released from the hospital and went back to the cottage to live with Louisa. They came into a little bit of money. For a while there, he felt he was receiving more income than he had ever received in his life. So he decided to buy himself a car, a clunker, which he was driving well past 70. And he got himself into a car accident, driving the car into a tree, a maple tree, just bumping his head. It was nothing serious. But at that point in time, he gave up driving and realized it was time to give up the car. He was steeped in correspondence at this point in time. He was steeped in giving firesides and study circles, and many of students of Louis Gregory or the Green Acre Baha'i School attended those firesides. He loved having people around. He loved sharing the cookies that both Louise and he made with the friends who attended those firesides. So he was easing off, but still not giving up the teaching. But even then, he was making an important impact on the subject of racial relations. Now, here's a story unto itself. And I'm sorry I'm hitting you up with so many stories, but this is an important one. Okay? In 1950, this is the year before his death, Lewis is corresponding with Judge Julius Waits Waring of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of South Carolina, who was involved in a case called Briggs versus Elliott. Some of you may have heard of this case. What was happening, first of all, this was a 3-panel court, 3 judges. And what was happening in the Briggs case was that a parent representing many Black parents in a county in South Carolina was bringing a suit against the president of the school board of the county, because in the county, they had a Black school made of wood and tar, a little shack with no running water, to which the Black students had to walk miles for their education. Whereas the white students in that county were bused to lavish brick schools throughout the county. So clearly there were differences in accommodations for the Blacks and for the white students. And he was bringing a suit not only to protest the disparate treatment, but to protest the very concept of segregation as being unconstitutional. This is one parent, Mr. Briggs. And who was Judge Waring? Judge Waring was one of the 3 judges on the court. He happened to be a judge who was appointed by Franklin Roosevelt. When he was appointed, he was moderate in his racial philosophy, coming from South Carolina, but later became an avid proponent of racial unity. This is a judge in South Carolina, an avid proponent of racial unity. He was so avid that as the chief judge of the court, he forbade the segregation of seats within his own courtroom. He would not allow whites to sit on one side and Blacks to sit on the other side of his courtroom, and proclaimed that whites and Blacks were mixed in his courtroom. He appointed a gentleman to be the plaintiff in his courtroom, a Black gentleman who was the plaintiff in his courtroom for the remainder of his tenure. Of course, which caused consternation, because the plaintiff is a valued position in any court. And he wrote so many articles. There was one quote, I hope I can find it, which I thought was very important. And bear with me, I'm going to look for it because it's important for me to share it with you. Well, what he was saying in essence was, when it comes to race unity, there's no room for gradualism. That was his banner as a writer, that the unity of the races must occur now. Now is the time, not gradually. It will never occur if it has to occur gradually. That was his philosophy. So he did everything he could, sitting on that court, to promote the concept of bringing the races together. And what happens in this case? The 2 of the 3 judges, not Judge Waring, decide we're going to ignore the whole segregation issue. We're not going to decide, because if we do, you know what's going to happen to us. The segregationists in South Carolina are very strong and will never survive. We'll never be able to continue in our current positions. So they sidestepped the whole issue of segregation as being unconstitutional. But what they did to appease the Black community was to demand that the schools be equalized immediately. What does that mean? It means that the county now has a responsibility of making the accommodations in that county for the Black students equal to those of the white students. Within the context of segregation, you're still segregated. We don't want the whites and Blacks mixed, but we want them in equal equally equal accommodations. So that was their decision, a very important decision. And oddly enough, there was a dissenter, and the dissenter was Judge Waring, who said, completely wrong, segregation is unconstitutional, it must come down now. Well, guess who he was being led by? Guess who was writing to him to share the Baha'i views on the subject of segregation? Louis Gregory was behind the scenes virtually submitting a private amicus curiae brief to one judge on that district court to educate him and further encourage him to take a diametrically opposed view when making a decision with the other members of his court. Oddly enough, this is an interesting story. After that decision was handed down, Judge Waring left South Carolina for New York because he knew he would not survive in South Carolina. He gave up being a judge and moved with his wife to New York. And guess what happened to the president of the school board and to everybody involved in that case on the government side? They lost their jobs. Why did they lose their jobs? Because of the outcome. Because that court demanded the equalization of the black and white schools. They lost their jobs. They failed to win that case. So to the very end, 1950, 1 year before his death, Lewis is playing an instrumental role. And in that case, Briggs versus Elliott was not decided by itself in the Supreme Court. That was merged into the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas case, the famous case that tore down segregation as unconstitutional in 1954. So this became part of that case. And guess who was arguing that case in the Brown case on behalf of the NAACP that supported Mr. Briggs? Thurgood Marshall, who became a Supreme Court justice himself. A very interesting turn of events here. One thing leads to another. And my own view is that this is not incidental. This is not incidental. The Baha'i Faith is propelling things to be moved along and making sure that racial unity progresses. Very, very interesting story. Tributes in passing. How much time do I have? Am I almost out of time? I guess a few minutes. I'll quickly go through this. Shoghi Effendi called him a source of inspiration and comfort. I'm always relieved by your letters, he said to him. You hardly realize what a help you are to me in my arduous work. He traveled extensively. He died suddenly at the home in Greenacre on 30 July 1951. He's buried in Mount Pleasant Cemetery near Greenacre High School, Elliott, Maine. The picture at the top is a picture of Mount Pleasant Cemetery. I could not find a picture of the actual gravestone or monument that may have been erected in his honor. Those who have been to Louis Gregory may have found one, but this is a picture of Mount Pleasant Cemetery where both Louis and Louisa are buried. On August the 1st, a memorial service was held at Greenacre. The room was overflowing. On August the 6th, 1951, Shoghi Effendi conferred on Gregory posthumously the rank of Hand of the Cause of God, making him the 8th person and the 4th Westerner, following John Esselmont, Keith Ransom Keller, Martha Root, to be so named in the period of 1925 to 52. He said, Shoghi Effendi, profoundly deplore grievous loss of dearly beloved, noble-minded, golden-hearted Louis Gregory. Shoghi Effendi cabled the Baha'is of the United States, rising Baha'i generation in African continent will glory in his memory and emulate his example. Keep that quote in mind because it's going to come up in the next slide or so. Keenly feel loss of one so loved, admired, and trusted by Abdu'l-Baha, deserves the rank of the first hand of the cause of his race. Louis Gregory holds a unique position in North American Baha'i history. In November 1951, the National Memorial Service, called for by Shoghi Effendi, was held in Wilmette. Louise attended and read a prayer for the departed. Tributes came in from Britain, India, Egypt, Tanganyika, Ethiopia. and friends from all parts of the country were present. It was described as an occasion of great inspiration and spiritual rededication. Further tributes. Of course, he partnered with Jim. He had 18 years of law practice partnering with Jim Cobb, partner and practicing on his own. He was described by Cobb as one of those who enriched the life of America. Baha'is have named institutions and activities in his honor. Among them, several schools in Africa were named after Louis Gregory. The Louis G. Gregory Baha'i Institute in Hemingway, South Carolina, 1972. That's the second picture on the left. That is the Louis Gregory Baha'i Institute, which teaches Baha'i teachers. And then in February 2003, the Louis Gregory Cottage, formerly the Arts and Crafts Building at Green Acre, has become a place of visitation. In February 2003, his boyhood home up to the sports court in Charleston was dedicated as the first museum in the city to honor a particular individual and the first Baha'i-owned museum in the United States. On the right, you'll see two pictures in the hallways of the museum in Charleston, South Carolina, the Louis Gregory Museum. After his death, tens of thousands of people, mostly rural African Americans, became Baha'is in South Carolina and other deep South states. The Louis Gregory Project. Remember, I asked you to keep a quote in mind that Shoghi Effendi made? I was hoping that Lex Musa, who's a Baha'i living in Maryland, who was very active in the Liberty Amendments Month celebrations that the Baha'is were involved in last year in Town of Vienna, would be on the call, because he's the one who started this, the Louis Gregory Project in 1997. It's a project which takes from the quote from Shoghi Effendi, the words, "glory in Louis's memory and emulate his example," and spreads it to the African Baha'is, especially the young African Baha'is, and tells them, please glory in Louis's memory and emulate his example, and to provide feedback on what it means to you and what you've learned in your lifetime with regard to the needs of your respective community that could be remedied through the principles that Louis Gregory aspired to. So it's a project to actually take the words from Shoghi Effendi and to encourage African Baha'is to use those words to do things in the name of Louis Gregory. By the way, I failed to mention that after the death of Louis Gregory, the Baha'i pioneers and recent converts in Uganda held a memorial service for Louis Gregory. Hence, Africa even felt the loss of Louis Gregory. And 2 years later, after that memorial service took place in Uganda, who emerges? Enoch Olinga, hand of the cause of God, to further the cause of the faith. And then the Louis Gregory Symposium on Race Unity, April the 22nd. This year, there was a symposium on race unity, kind of a follow-up to the Race Amity conferences, but a symposium at the Houston Tilson University in Austin, Texas, in the chapel, which was the 102nd anniversary of this Race Unity Symposium. So this has been going on for quite a bit of time at this very same university, commemoration of Louis Gregory's strive to achieve race unity. Very important. What about Louisa? She's buried in Mount Pleasant Cemetery. We know that she was on the SS Cedric. We know that she was the first Baha'i in Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, teaching throughout Europe, but on the side of Louis Gregory in the teaching efforts and at the end of his life. This is a quote from one of the authors. Life of Louis Gregory is one which will continue for generations to inspire others. She walked the thorny pathway of life, serene in the knowledge that God hath ordained for her that path and no other. Never did her feet deviate. She walked unhesitatingly through the bigotry and prejudice which were freely strewn in her way. with consummate dignity, she became an example of self-sacrifice and radiant yielding to the decree of God. Living out the years of her long life, far from comfort and security, she knew as a girl in her English countryside home to stand hand in hand with the husband she felt was her gift from God. Quite a quote. I'm going to end it after this. This is a poem that I found on a blog called Baha'u'llah's Stupendous Revelation. I started with a poem from Robert Hayden. I'm going to end this with a poem from Louis Gregory. The Bab, O herald of the King of Kings, from whom creation's power springs, the mission thine to blaze the way, which leads to realms of endless day, to be thyself the mystic sign of perfect love and power divine, to resurrect the souls of men, and wealth devise beyond our ken. Thy shining form was sometimes sad, yet still thou madest creation glad. Through martyrdom didst plant the seeds, which fructified in wondrous deeds. Grant all through deeds without desire to witness thy celestial fire. Baha'u'llah, O manifested Son of Man, thy sheen the reign of peace began. Thine exile proved to man his home. Thy shackles freed the souls to roam. The universe of God's great love, directed by the heavenly dove. The kings, their homage due to thee, enthroned, ethereal majesty, shall bring the treasures of the earth, memorial to thy cycle's birth. The sweetest carols angels sing, proclaim the oneness of our King. O deathless flame of beauty bright, set fire our souls, bestow thy might. Abdu'l-Baha, O servant of the light of God, help us to bear the chastening rod. Like thee to bless when others curse, so shape our lives by heaven's verse. How like the Father through the years didst thou restrain the founts of tears, which in thy children sought to flow forth from the deep of human woe. How cheered the hearts that turn to thee. How sweet thy rare humility. With wisdom great thou didst the ark guide through the storms of hatred dark. To vivify the souls endeared, the mystery of God appeared. So another role for Louis Gregory, the role of poet. There were some questions here. I don't think we have the time to go through the questions, but you can see that there are references at the back of this presentation, and I encourage everyone to go through those references. This was quite a life. This was quite a life. And I just sat there in awe as I read this life and tried to put it in a form that was understandable and chronologically correct. The book by Gail Morrison was a little bit difficult to get through because you kind of lose track of the chronology of things. But with the help of the other book by Janet Russo and other materials that I found, I was able to piece it together to show the evolution. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I hope you gained something from it. And I hope you will attend future presentations of this kind.
Thank you, John. That was very interesting. A lot of information. I didn't know he was he was the first recording secretary, and he helped to draft the National Spiritual Assembly bylaws. It's very interesting, and his work on the race amity. It's yeah. I just attended a race amity event at the Baha'i Center a couple weeks ago. It was very good. So the timing is perfect.
Where was this event?
At the Northern Virginia Baha'i Center.
Oh, wow. Wow. So the timing of this presentation is perfect.
Yes.
Juneteenth, we're celebrating the Liberty Amendments Month this month in Vienna, which was endorsed, by the way, by the House of Delegates of the Virginia legislature. the resides event taking place at the Baha'i Center. Good timing for this.
Well, thank you for putting it together and presenting it today. Does anyone on the call have any questions for John?
It was great. Really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I believe we have a closing.
So the
comment.
next one, John. So
Thank
really
you.
looking forward to it. Thank you. This was wonderful.
Thank you. This will be on YouTube, right? For those who were unable to attend.
Yes, we will. This was recorded and we'll post it to the YouTube channel, the Center Events Task Force channel. And that link to the channel is on the invite that was sent out with the flyer. It's on the flyer itself.
Great.
All right, so yeah, we'll close with a prayer. I'm gonna share my screen.
Oh God, this is a broken winged bird. This is a broken winged bird. Oh God, and his flight is very slow. His flight is very slow. Assist him so he may fly towards the apex of prosperity and salvation, and wing his way with the utmost joy and happiness, joy and happiness, and wing his way through the utmost joy and happiness, joy and happiness through the illimitable space. This is a broken winged bird, 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 a broken
Okay. Thank you again, John. Very much appreciated.
Thank you, friends.
Okay. We'll see you next time. Have a good night.
Yeah.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.